Greetings, class. This is your instructor, James Stevens, back with another audio lecture for HWE 100. We are in Chapter 11 this week, Nutrients Involved in Bone Health. And so I'd like to discuss some of these nutrients, actually more importantly discuss bone health in general and talk a little bit about osteoporosis. Now, if I was to ask you all, or any of you, what nutrient it is that you think of what food or nutrient that you think of immediately when you hear the words bone health, my guess I would not have to wait very long for you to mention this very popular beverage in the United States, milk, which, as we all know, is a significant source of calcium. And it makes me wonder why we develop such strong associations between foods and nutrients and maybe disease states. This is something that we've explored in past video lectures, and so I think it's important to revisit again, and especially in this chapter, because I want you to think about if there is maybe a influential organization here in the United States that perhaps helps strengthen this association that we already have strongly ingrained between milk, calcium, and bone health. And it may not take you very long to recognize or realize which organization I'm talking about, and that of course is the Dairy Council, who is a very powerful marketing organization here in the United States that posts billboards and other media images, commercials, posters, etc., about the benefits of drinking milk and how that will relate to strong bones. Now, you might then start to wonder, well, why is it that the United States has such a high rate of osteoporosis and poor bone density? We are one of the highest consumers globally, worldwide. We're one of the highest consumers of milk and thus calcium in the entire world. And so you would think, well, if we see these images and we receive these messages that drinking milk correlates to strong bones, why is it that we then have such high rates of osteoporosis? Because drinking all this milk, which is high in calcium, should correlate to stronger bones. That's the message that we hear. And in fact, that's not the case. Now, I'm not trying to send or convey an anti-milk, anti-dairy council message. I'm just trying to get you to think about what this may mean. And the way I interpret it is that, maybe there's this American paradox that exists where yes, we are the highest consumers, or one of the highest consumers of milk and dairy products, and thus consume a tremendous amount of calcium, yet have this high rate of osteoporosis. Well, maybe we're over-focusing, we're over-emphasizing on one food and one nutrient when it comes to bone health, when in fact, as we know, there are many nutrients and many foods that can promote good, strong bones. If we look at another nation, or another culture, that is, and that is the Asian culture, and we look at their common dietary patterns here in this traditional healthy Asian diet pyramid, we see that dairy foods are not recommended 3 times a day, as the Dairy Council recommends us to drink 3 cups of milk, not 2 times a day, not even 1 time a day, but dairy food is an optional food as part of their diet. Yet Asians, though they do suffer from osteoporosis, it's a rate that's lower than what we have here in the United States. You would look at this and say, well, geez, they don't drink, or milk and dairy is not a big part of their diet. They should have higher rates of osteoporosis, not lower rates. So again, my message is that maybe we're focusing on too much on one food and one nutrient when it comes to bone health. And my hope is that through this chapter and the information contained within it, you'll realize that it's not just one food, it's not just one nutrient, but many foods. It's really the entire diet. Also, when we think about bones, I think many of us we just think, well, you reach a certain height, your bones are growing through that time period, and then you reach that height, and then that's the end of the road. Your bones from that point forward are just stagnant, static structures. And in fact, they're actually very dynamic structures. A lot of us, I think, we also just view bone as a structure that's very rigid. And in fact, it is hard and durable, and that's due to the molecule known as hydroxyapatite. It sounds like it should be a dietary supplement in its own when I say it, but it's actually a compound that's in our bone that gives it that characteristic rigidness and hardness that we think of. However, bones are not all rigid material. We wouldn't want them to be all rigid material, because if they were overly rigid, anytime the bones made contact with something, then they would very easily crack or break. We want to have some flexible component to bone as well, and we have that in the form of collagen, which is a protein. Many of you have heard of collagen before. You may know it's in your hair, it's in your skin, and those are kind of flexible parts of the body, right? Or structures in the body. So our bones actually have some flexibility, they have some give. So that way when we do hit the ground or make an impact, we don't always our bones aren't so brittle that they break on impact. Again, bone is a dynamic organ. As you're sitting listening to this audio lecture, your bones are going through this process, constant process called remodeling. And remodeling of bone has two phases. Just like if you were to remodel a kitchen or a bathroom, you have to do the demolition first. And that's what we call bone resorption. That's the breaking down of the old bone that's no longer healthy or viable. So just like when you do a bathroom remodel, you want to get rid of the old outdated countertops and the old tile, the old flooring, so on and so forth. You got to do that first before you put in the new structures. So cells known as osteoclasts help to do the demolition of old bone, and then other cells known as osteoblasts come in and they form or build the new bone using that hydroxyapatite. And you get some or visual here of the osteoclasts and osteoblasts, two distinct separate cells that work in bone in the process of bone remodeling. So our bones, not only are they obviously growing until we reach our maximum height, but they're also becoming more dense up until around age 30. After age 30, we see a very slight, slow, gradual loss of that bone density. In other words, those osteoclasts responsible for the demolition, as we said, they're working a little bit harder now than the osteoblasts. Okay, the osteoblasts are starting to decline in their formation of new bone. Thus, we have this slow, gradual loss of bone density. Now, this slow, gradual loss becomes accelerated in women at menopause as the woman's body starts producing estrogens. Estrogens are like the foreman of the osteoblasts. Remember, the osteoblasts are the yes, estrogen is like a boss or a foreman that is telling the osteoblasts to do work, encouraging them to build new bone. Well, once we remove that estrogen, we no longer have that foreman, that boss, telling the osteoblasts what to do to build new bone. So what happens? In the absence of a boss, we know that we slack off. We don't have someone telling us what to do. We don't do our job quite as diligently as we once did. So we lose that encouragement to work harder. And so at menopause, with the loss of estrogen, the osteoblasts really slack off and bone density drops dramatically, as we'll see in a moment. Now in us males, myself included, we don't undergo or go through menopause, but we do have this slow decline in testosterone levels, and testosterone is our foreman of our body's osteoblasts. So with that slow decline in testosterone, we also have a decline in bone density across the lifespan, starting at around age 30. So here we see a nice figure of a woman's, or two examples of a woman's bone density, and how important it is that for you gals who are listening, if you're under the age of 30, you want to do everything that you can right now to build as much bone density as possible. Because male or female, once you hit age 30, there's going to be this long plateau period. And yes, there will be a slow gradual loss. It's not undetectable. It's not really shown on this figure, but it is happening. Once you reach menopause, though, it's not going to any longer be a slow gradual loss, but a very rapid loss in bone density, as you see here. Now, if you haven't built up as much bone density until age 30 as possible, because maybe you thought, well, once I hit 18 and I reached my maximum height, I don't need to drink milk, I don't need to worry about my bones. You start getting into some other unhealthy lifestyle behaviors. Well, there's that 12-year period where you missed building as much bone as you could have. Now when you reach menopause and that bone loss becomes very dramatic with the absence of estrogen, now you're going to be likely to have bone issues, namely osteoporosis. So what is osteoporosis? It's characterized by this low bone mass or low bone density. The bones literally become porous, as the name implies, and now the likelihood of a fracture is heightened, strongly elevated. There are some characteristic changes in the spine, and women will lose height, sometimes 2 to 3 inches over the course of a couple of decades, as we see this illustration shows us. How do we diagnose osteoporosis? Well, it's done through a machine known as a DEXA machine, dual energy X-ray absorptometry, and this DEXA machine generates what we call a T-score. So here we see an elderly woman who's getting a DEXA scan on her hip, it looks like, to measure her hip's bone density. The World Health Organization uses these guidelines to help physicians diagnose osteoporosis, and you see that the diagnosis of osteoporosis comes at a T-score of -2.5. The DEXA scan can also be used to look at one's spinal column bone density as well, as we see here from the results of this DEXA scan. Why do we care about osteoporosis? Well, osteoporosis is what I consider to be the other silent killer, with the other silent killer being high blood pressure or hypertension. We don't see our bones on a regular basis. We don't go and get DEXA scans routinely from the doctor's office, so we really don't know what our bones are doing until we find out, until we may suffer from a fracture. And at that point, we can see that the fractures can be quite debilitating and can significantly reduce quality of life in the people who experience them, sadly. It's a very expensive disease to treat, as you see here. This is an old statistic I have, an old figure of $13 to $18 billion a year to treat fractures. The main thing, though, is that many people who experience a fracture, particularly a hip fracture, they will very likely never regain their previous high quality of life. And in fact, some, after just 1 year, may not even be alive. That's a very high 1-year mortality rate related to hip fractures. There's many factors that influence the risk of osteoporosis. What I think I'll do is stop here and start up a part 2 for this audio lecture. So join me for that.